Hi, Dr. Dolly. My name is Neil. I'm a first year resident in the state of Georgia, doing a transitional year right now. I'll start radiology training in Florida next summer. My wife and I are married with three young children, and we have about $385,000 of total student loan debt mixed between my med school loans and some of her undergrad and graduate loans. Right now, we make $120,000 together as a married couple, and our question is about this new SAVE plan for student loans. I'm not planning on going into public service loan forgiveness, given the job market for radiology and private practice just pays so much more. But my question is, with the new SAVE plan, it seems like I can get the best of both worlds, even without having to change my tax filing status, where I could get 0% interest rate and a low monthly payment, at least for this year, and potentially next year re-up and still have a low payment, even if I have to change the married filing separately. Is there something that I'm missing here? Because it seems like trying to refinance with a private lender would give me a really bad deal with still 5 to 6% interest that might balloon up over my next 5 years of training, since radiology takes a long time. Thanks for everything you do. I really appreciate the help.
All right. Student loans. I don't even know where to start with this question. Where should we start, SC?
I think we start with, first of all, congrats on staying up on the latest and greatest. I think a lot of times physicians just think, oh, I have student loans. One day I'll repay them with all the money I have. And so looking at this so early on in your career is really phenomenal. And indeed, I think this is extremely exciting. It's extremely exciting for new residents, folks coming into training. I mean, just imagine you have the opportunity to watch your student loans get to stay the same amount versus balloon up, which pre-COVID forbearance is what a lot of residents had to watch happen. I mean, don't you think this is a great, great new exciting development?
The blog post I wrote yesterday is titled How to Go to Medical School Almost for Free. And the truth is, and it's a series of changes, right? This is a number of changes starting in 2007 through this year that have been made to the student loan programs. They are incredibly generous now. In fact, I would actually argue from a policy standpoint, we probably now made them too generous. But that would not stop me from taking advantage of them. And I don't think it should stop you from taking advantage of them either. But the truth is, done right, you can go to medical school for dimes on the dollar now. You might think medical school costs $200,000 or $300,000, but in reality, for most people, if you do this right, medical school costs less than $100,000. It just does. Thanks to SAVE and all the little tactics you can use to keep your payments down and then getting public service loan forgiveness for the rest. Medical school in some respects is cheaper than it has ever been. But you have to understand the plans and the programs and the opportunities to do that. All right, so SAVE. SAVE is the new thing. This is the new REPAYE. And what are the basics of SAVE, SC?
Yeah, so basically, Save is replacing Repay, and there's a couple things that are pretty exciting about it. So, it takes the percentage that you pay. Previously in Repay and PAYE, you're paying 10% of your discretionary income is going down to 5, and then
Five,
discretionary
five for
income
undergrad, right? It's still 10 for
for
graduate.
10 for graduate, 5 for undergrad, and then if you mix them, they give you a weighted average. Thank you for that. Yes. And then what's really cool too is they increase what they consider kind of the poverty line. So what you're essentially doing is getting a lower payment. And if you think about it in theory, what this means, especially think about it for a physician just coming into their training, you are literally going to be able to pay $100, a couple $100, just a very very small amount. And the SAVE program is adding in the ability to not accumulate interest. So any unpaid interest is going to be essentially taken away. So you're literally going to have a small payment that counts towards PSLF. So even if you are not sure you're going into public service loan forgiveness, you're still going to be accumulating those credits toward it. Very, very small payment with Save. I don't know a ton of other of incentives to move into a different income driven repayment because of how attractive Save is. And so this is just going to be great news. And even people that don't go into public service loan forgiveness, they can use Save to get ahead on other financial goals. They can be saving for retirement while they're in training, or accumulating a lot of cash, so that they can, once they get out, maybe refinance the debt if they can get a better rate, pay off a big chunk of it. So there's a lot of flexibility that we now have because of the SAVE program that we could not be more excited about.
Yeah. This is really generous, right? I mean, there was all this press, right, about Biden's forgiveness plan that you get $10,000 forgiven, or if you had a Pell Grant, $20,000 forgiven, right? It goes to the Supreme Court. Everybody talks about it. It's a big political talking point. Meanwhile, under the radar, doctors are saving 10 or 20 or $30,000 a year in interest. Now, same thing as during the pandemic emergency where your payments were $0 and your interest rate was 0%. It's essentially the same thing now during residency, right? Your interest rate is 0% and you are saving how much? If you got $300,000 in student loans at 6%, that's 18 grand a year in interest you're saving. Or most of it. You'll be paying a little bit of it. This is a huge benefit. It's incredibly generous. And nobody's suing the Department of Education over this. Nobody seems to care. So great for you. Take advantage. It's awesome.
It
But
is
yeah, I
great.
mean, I mean, look at this. Your payments are smaller because now they define your discretionary income more generously. Instead of your income minus 150% of poverty line, it's your income minus 225% of poverty line. And under repay, half of your unpaid interest was waived. Now all of your unpaid interest is waived. I mean, this is super generous. Of course, you want to be in SAVE. If you are single, you want to be in SAVE. If you are married to a non earner, you want to be in SAVE. If you are married to a low earner, you want to be in SAVE. Now, some of you married to an attending may not want to be in SAVE. It's possible you'll want to be in the old PAYE program. But even compared to repay, Save has the benefit that you can file married filing separately, which you couldn't do under repay. You used to have to go into the PAYE program in order to file married filing separately. Now you can do that under Save. The only benefit of the PAYE program is that there's a cap on your payments, which usually matters once you become an attending, for people with very low debt to income ratios that are still going for public service loan forgiveness. So it's really a very small percentage of people for whom SAVE is not the right IDR program. So I think that's one of the big takeaways of our discussion here is if you're like, I don't know, ICR, IBR, pay, repay, save, I don't know which one to do. The answer is probably save. For almost everybody, it's going to be SAVE. So if you're not in that program, get in that program. If you're just coming out of medical school, enroll in that program. SAVE is the bomb. It's this great new, very generous program from the federal government because they want to make medical school and really college and education in general a whole lot cheaper, a whole lot easier to do.
Can I just
Um,
add one more thing really
yeah.
quickly to this? Because this is what I think listeners need to really understand about student loans. There's a lot in finances that you really can put into autopilot. And I think if we have any takeaways, what you were saying about the Biden forgiveness is that the SAVE program is not as simple to understand as the Biden forgiveness. And so that's why I don't think it's going in the news. But I also think it's one that people could actually miss out on. And what I think any physician listening to this it needs to hear, because I have been seeing this with my own eyes, and I'm sure you've been reading tons of mail on this, is that putting things in autopilot on student loans typically does not yield better results. So it doesn't take a ton to get a good student loan plan. If you don't want to do the work yourself, I think you need to hire someone to do it because especially if you're going to public service loan forgiveness, yes, SAVE is really good, but when you come out into your attending level position, before you get out of the ability to get a partial financial hardship and go back into payee, you need to be able to get back into that program to cap your payments at that 10-year amortization on the student loans. So I think the bigger message here is student loans are extremely complicated and you have to understand them. You can't just put your loans into something.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, a couple of years ago, we realized that people just weren't doing it right, and we started studentloanadvice.com. And that's basically just gives advice about your student loans. That's all they do is student loans. And for one flat rate, they will meet with you, make sure you're in the right student loan plan, show you all the tips that you can do to kind of maximize the benefits of those federal programs, help you know if and when you should refinance, et cetera. And I think the average they saved people last year was $191,000. So it's been an incredible value for people to use that, and they're pretty busy right now, as you can imagine. But you can still book consults. Studentloanadvice.com is where you do that. All right, can I be the bad guy? I feel like we got to address this elephant in the room here. With these generous student loan programs, there's a lot of moral hazard, right? And remember, moral hazard is not an ethical term. This is an economic term. Okay. Moral hazard is when people make different decisions than they otherwise would because of, an unintended consequence of a law or policy. So we have made, going to college and paying for it with student loans so attractive now that there's a lot of downsides to this. So let's think about a few of them. One is that people get really mad, right? Imagine all those people who paid off their student loans, right? And now they see all these doctors getting 200, 300, $400,000 forgiven, right? There's a fair amount of legislative risk when people realize what's going on. The doctors are going to medical school almost for free. So that's one downside of these generous programs. Another one is there's almost no incentive whatsoever for medical schools to keep their tuition down now, right? Because people can borrow the entire cost of attendance. Most of them won't even think about it because they just want to be a doctor, number one. But number two, if they're savvy about student loan management, they realize, I'm probably not going to have to pay this back anyway. And even if I do, it'll be with dramatically depreciated dollars. And so, this affects people. This affects people who pay for medical school using family money, people that work their way through, or their spouse helped them work their way through, people who are actually paying their loans back, people who go to schools where they couldn't get federal student loans, like Caribbean schools, people who don't match, or people who can't get a PSLF qualifying job. All those people are hurt by this increase in tuition that comes from these generous student loan programs. I don't know if you've run into this either, because I don't know how many clients you've had that are medical students, but I have medical students emailing me all the time going, I really only need this much money this year, but they're going to let me borrow this much money. I think I'm going to go for PSLF. Should I take it all? Right. And so people are borrowing money they wouldn't otherwise borrow and probably not investing it. They're probably spending it. And so people are living their lives differently than they would because these things are so generous. We also have these other things. We got a few medical schools that are free, at least for people of a certain income. We got MD, PhD programs. We got the military HPSP program. We got Indian Health Services. We got the National Health Service Corps. Why would you sign up to go to Iraq for 4 years to pay for your medical school when you can get it all forgiven via public service loan forgiveness? So I predict that in a few years, all of these programs, these contract programs, these MD, PhD programs, are going to have a lot more problems recruiting people into their programs because the loan programs have become so generous. What do you think about all these moral hazards that have come from these changes to the federal loan programs?
I think the moral hazards are significant. The interesting thing, though, just taking non MDs. So we do retirement plans. And so we see a lot of people in hospitals who, work the front desk and have $50,000 in student loans from a college degree they didn't even finish and will never have any hope of actually paying it off. I think that these folks are saying, oh my God, I was sold a bill of goods. And what am I ever going to do? PSLF comes around and, they're crying in relief, but they're also saying, I will never, ever let my kids go through this. So I do think that the relief is good in a variety of different ways. And I think for people who have actually suffered under the payments, under student loan defaults, I think that's great too. I also hate student loans, even as much as I love the incentives for our physicians. You can't bankrupt them. I think they're quite un American. I think it's a terrible way to do debt. We don't do this in the US. Like, we don't hold, debt that you cannot ever repay over people like this. So I am hoping that at least on the undergrad level, that we're already getting that message feedback back, that people are not going to just keep paying increasing tuitions funded by student loan debt. But on the med school side, yes. And in fact, I have two med schools where I actually speak to the first and second years, and I see them taking out these loans, and I'm begging them to set a budget, one that they can use through residency and then into their attending level pay, which minimizes the student loan debt, because you don't know what the future is in your first and second years of med school. Like, how many people actually know that they're going to go into radiology versus a job, where they're likely going to work at a PSLF eligible institution? I just don't think it's that many. I think it's playing with fire. As you and I have seen, we're seeing debt loads now that are more than one time's income. And at that level, you're making very significant life decisions around that debt that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I don't like seeing physicians do that. So I think there are moral hazards around the borrowing. But I do think if we can get enough education to the borrowers, that they really don't have a huge incentive to rack up because of the potential risk that they're not going to benefit from PSLF.
Yeah, there certainly is risk there. Not every job qualifies, but there are a lot of jobs that do. If you're willing to go to a different area of the country and work in a VA, work for the military, stay in academia, those jobs all qualify for PSLF. We need to talk a little bit about refinancing too. Part of the question we got on the speak pipe was about refinancing, and this is another one of those possibly unintended effects of not only the student loan holiday during the pandemic emergency, but also, these new generous, rules for PSLF, this new SAVE program. This has decimated the student loan refinancing industry. Absolutely, the volume of loans being refinanced is a tiny fraction of what it was just a few years ago. All these companies, I think our sponsor for this episode was SoFi. They're just seeing a whole lot less people. And that's not only because it's more attractive to stay in the federal loan system, but also because interest rates also went up dramatically over the last year or two. So let's talk about when it actually still makes sense to refinance. And I think the first takeaway message that everybody ought to take is, if you have private loans, if you have loans that are not federal loans and you can get a lower interest rate, you should still refinance them. You should refinance early and often. And we have links at the White Coat Investor where you get cash back. Currently, we're still giving away our flagship online course for anybody who refinances through our links. It still makes sense to refinance those links. People coming out of Caribbean schools with 10% student loans, yes, you can still knock off 4 or 5% off your student loans. You're not going to get the 2% that people were getting a few years ago, but it's still well worth your time to refinance. However, I think it is a more difficult decision for those with federal loans.
So I agree with this too. I mean, we were running some numbers on this as well. We're seeing some refi rates that are really good for our clients right now. And if you have a 6 or 6.8% federal loan, you're not going into PSLF. That you're ruled it out. You're coming out of residency, going into what I call the big doc pay. I mean, you can knock $12,000, $13,000 off a $300,000 loan. It makes a lot of sense in that situation, especially given that we're seeing fixed rates now that are 5%. Like, if you can get that 5.5% even, it still can make a lot of sense. And it's not just for 5-year loans. We're seeing them for 10-year. The other thing too is I'm starting to see some physicians who, kind of accidentally have gotten into some credit card debt. And, we're seeing a lot of lifestyle inflation that's happened during COVID that was really unintentional. It happened to me. It is really serious, just how much things cost more, right? And so we've seen some physicians get into some credit card debt. And I was working with one yesterday, and we realized, gosh, 30,000 in credit card debt. Let's look at one of these personal loans. Like, so I think that that's also something that people need to realize. Like, don't let that sit there. pay that interest, the 19, 20 to 25% interest month after month after month, really, really knock that down as quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people just don't realize what a debt emergency looks like. And when you've got debt that's 10% plus, that is a debt emergency, right? I mean, that debt is doubling every 7 years at 10%. At 20% is doubling every 3 years. I mean, that is a fantastic guaranteed return to pay back a 10, 20, 30% loan. So it makes less sense to carry debt now that interest rates are higher than it used to. You may be more likely to pay on your mortgage, more likely to pay on your student loans, more likely to pay on credit card debt rather than invest. As a few years ago, people struggled all the time with, do I pay back this loan I've refinanced to 2 or 3%? But to the questioner's point, right, it basically didn't make a lot of sense before to refinance federal student loans during residency. You're generally better off in repay than you were refinancing those loans at the beginning of residency. Not everybody. If you're married to another high earner, that's not necessarily the case. But for most people, that decision for your federal loans happened when you left residency, or maybe if there's a lag in certifying your income, a year after you left residency or fellowship. But that's probably still going to make sense for a lot of people that are paying back their loans, going from 6.8%, or as loans go up now, because they'll be higher next year for borrowing medical students, to get that down to 5 or 5.5%. That's still a good deal to knock a couple percent off your interest rate.
The hosts of The White Coat Investor are not licensed accountants, attorneys, or financial advisors. This podcast is for your entertainment and information only. It should not be considered professional or personalized financial advice. You should consult the appropriate professional for specific advice relating to your situation.